What is up you guys, welcome back to my channel. It is great to see you all again. Today we are talking all about camera basics. So in this video we're just going to be talking over all the settings of cameras and how you can get around them. So for many of you, you've probably opened your camera before and you've seen this. Now for me, the very first time I did that I freaked, because seeing all those numbers and all those little things, it can be really confusing, but it's actually really simple. So when it comes to camera settings, there are three basic settings that you need to be concerned with. There is aperture, ISO and shutter speed. Now all of these can be adjusted individually and separately to each other, but in the end they all work together to make your final image. Now the first camera setting that we're going to be talking about is aperture. So aperture is basically a little thing in your camera that opens and closes, creating a hole. So this little hole controls the amount of light that is going into your camera. Obviously, the more wide open your aperture is, the more light it will let in to go back and hit your sensor. And if that aperture is narrow, it will let less light in and therefore less light hitting your camera sensor. Not only does the aperture control the amount of light entering your camera, but it also can play a part in your focus. So if your camera is wide open with a wide aperture, your focus will be a shallow depth of field. So that's when an object is in focus and everything in the background is blurry. Everything in terms of aperture is measured in f-stops. So if you open your camera and you look at those signs that have an F and a slash and a number, that is what aperture is. The easiest way to think of these symbols is to think of them as fractions. So f22 in reality would be f1 over 22.
Quick maths!
So this will be a really small opening, letting in a little amount of light and giving you a deep depth of field. So everything is in focus. Whereas f1.8 will be a bigger opening, letting in lots of light, and it'll give you a shallow depth of field. So your subject will be in focus and everything in the background will be blurred. So next time you open your camera and you see that pretty confusing F symbol, just remember that the bigger the number, the smaller the opening, and that controls the amount of light coming into your camera and that it can play a part in focusing your camera. There is also a thing called an aperture chart. I'll put that up here on screen. And if you are still a beginner and you can't remember all the aperture things and what they do, this can just be used kind of like a cheat sheet. So if you ever wonder what this aperture does, you just look on the chart and it'll tell you exactly what it does, how much light it lets in, the focus, all of that stuff. Moving on to the setting that is ISO. I'm actually not too sure what this stands for, but technically speaking, ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to the light around it. A low number or a low ISO will mean that your sensor is less sensitive to light, so therefore it'll be darker. Whereas a higher ISO, so a higher number, will mean that your sensor is more sensitive to light and therefore it'll be brighter. So if you're in a darker environment, you want to pump up your ISO a little bit more, meaning that your sensor will be more sensitive to light and therefore your picture will be brighter. But don't pump up your ISO too high, because the higher your ISO, the more likely your picture is to become grainy, and then that just makes for a really non-clear, non-sharp image. Alright, moving on to the third and final setting, that is shutter speed. So in your camera there is a thing called a shutter. This is kind of what it looks like. And what this shutter does is it opens and closes to expose your camera sensor to light. So this means it can control two variables, the amount of light entering your picture as well as the amount of blur in your picture. In your camera, shutter speed is measured as a fraction of a second. So if your shutter speed is 1/250, it means 1/250th of a second. So just for a bit of comparison, here we have 1/50th of a second and here we have 1/250th of a second. So obviously 1/50th of a second is longer, so therefore your shutter will open longer, exposing your sensor to the light for longer, so therefore your picture will be a lot brighter compared to the 1/250th of a second that will open very quickly and it'll only expose your camera to a light for that 1/250th of a second. So your picture will most likely be a little bit darker. Now I said that shutter speed controls both your light and the blurriness of your picture. So we've covered light. So now we're going to move on to the blurriness or sharpness of your picture. So this totally depends on what you're wanting to take a picture of. If you're taking a picture of a moving object, let's say a car, you want to have a much quicker shutter speed. Whereas if you're taking a picture of something that is not moving, let's say a plant or a leaf or a flower, your shutter speed doesn't have to be as fast. The reason for this is if you have a fast shutter speed and you're taking a picture of a moving object, that shutter will be able to open and close before that object moves within your frame. Whereas if you're shooting that same fast object and you have a slow shutter speed, that shutter will open and that object will move in frame and then it'll close. So therefore that is how a blurry picture is created. So to help you guys out, I took two pictures of me throwing a ball in the air. Here is the one with a much faster shutter speed. So in this picture you can see that the ball was the moving object and that everything is sharp and in focus. So I had to have a much quicker shutter speed in order to capture this. Compared to the second picture where you can see that the ball is blurry because that shutter is open for a long time, meaning that the ball moves in frame before that shutter closes, making a blurry image. Shutter speed is actually one of the more cool settings because you can use it to do things such as long exposure photography. So what people do in long exposure photography is they open that shutter speed for a long amount of time and it'll track the light that moves through the frame. So if you've ever seen astrophotography like this, or if you've ever seen photography using car lights like this, those are both made because that shutter is open for such a long amount of time and it allows the light to track across the frame before it closes. So let's just quickly go over what we've been through today. We have aperture, which is that little thing that opens and closes. The bigger the aperture, the smaller the number, the more light it lets in, and it also has a shallow depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the bigger the number, the less light it lets in, and it'll have a deep depth of field, so everything will be in focus. Then we have ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor to light, and that can just make your picture brighter or darker depending on what you need. Lastly, we have shutter speed, which is the amount of time that that shutter in your camera is open for. The quicker your shutter speed, the more sharp your image will be and the less light it will let in. The longer your shutter speed, the more your image will be blurred if it is a moving object, and the more light it will let in. As I said in the beginning, all three of these settings work together and can be used to compensate each other in order to make your image. So for example, if you need a really fast shutter speed to take a picture of a fast moving object, you might just want to bump up your ISO a bit to brighten the picture. So there you guys have it. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and to subscribe to this channel for future videos. Also, if you have any ideas for videos that you'd like me to make, please be sure to leave them down in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to those because I still have 2 weeks of lockdown. So yeah, that's it from me today. I really hope you guys have a good day and that you stay safe, and until next time, cheers.